Brooklyn was alive that evening, but Andrea Walker felt the entire city had turned its back on her. The world outside her window pulsed with music and laughter, car horns singing their endless chorus voices, spilling out of bars and cafes, where people clinked glasses to celebrate the simple fact of being alive. And yet, in her tiny apartment, with peeling paint and dim yellow light, Andrea sat at the edge of her couch, staring at the cake she had bought herself. 32 candles unlit, a silence too heavy for one woman to bear. Her phone screen glowed. No messages, no calls. The man who was supposed to show up her on and off boyfriend, who always promised he would do better next time, had canceled an hour ago. Work emergency, he'd written. Andrea laughed bitterly at the message. Work emergency on her birthday. She wasn't a fool. She knew exactly where he was, probably entertaining someone younger, prettier, and less complicated than her. Andrea had built her life on resilience. She was the kind of woman who patched her broken sink, paid her bills on time, and fought through college with 2 part-time jobs while her friends partied at spring break. She had always been the strong one, the reliable one. But tonight, when the universe decided to remind her that another year had passed, she wasn't sure if she wanted to be strong anymore. She poured herself a glass of wine, then another. The wine was sharp, burning, yet it wasn't enough to soften the ache in her chest. "Happy birthday to me," she whispered, raising the glass to no one. The candles remained unlit. The night grew heavier, pressing on her like a weight she couldn't shake off. And then, in a moment of reckless abandon, born out of loneliness, bitterness, and too much alcohol, Andrea picked up her phone. Her fingers hesitated for a moment, trembling above the screen. Then, almost defiantly, she texted her best friend Maya. "I don't care anymore. Find me the hottest escort in Brooklyn. Tonight. I deserve at least one man who shows up when I ask." It was absurd. It wasn't like her. Andrea Walker didn't do things like this. She was the woman who said no, who judged her friends when they confessed to one-night stands. But the pain of being forgotten, of being invisible, clawed at her chest until she couldn't breathe. Minutes later, Maya replied, "Girl, are you serious?" Andrea typed back, "Dead serious. Don't ask questions." There was a pause. Then, "Fine. Give me 10 minutes. Andrea laughed through the fog of alcohol. The sound startled her. It was jagged, bitter, not at all the laugh of a woman celebrating her birthday. She thought about all the birthdays she had spent waiting for someone to love her properly. Waiting for a father who walked out. Waiting for a mother too broken to care. And waiting for boyfriends who promised the moon but barely showed her the sidewalk. Tonight, she was done waiting. When the knock came on her door, Andrea's heart stuttered. She grabbed her purse, her heels, and a bottle of perfume she hadn't worn in months. Without thinking, she rushed down the stairs, her pulse thrumming like a drumbeat in her ears. But fate, fickle, mischievous, cruel fate, was about to redirect her steps. Across the city in Manhattan, a very different story was unfolding. At JFK Airport, a sleek private jet, bearing the emblem of Lopez Global Holdings, had just touched down. Santiago Lopez, heir to one of America's most powerful financial empires, had returned. The press would call it a homecoming. The board members would call it a strategic move. But to Santiago, it was simply a necessity. He had spent years abroad conquering Europe's markets, building his reputation as a ruthless, brilliant billionaire, whose touch turned everything to gold. And now, back in New York, he was here to reclaim his throne, to silence whispers that he had abandoned his father's legacy. He was 35 with a sharp jaw, storm gray eyes, and the presence that filled any room before he spoke. The tabloids called him the Ice King of Wall Street. Women called him untouchable. And Santiago himself believed none of them were wrong. Love. He had seen what it did to people. Love had destroyed his mother, an elegant woman who had given everything to a man who couldn't stay faithful. Love had weakened his father until scandal nearly swallowed the empire whole. Santiago Lopez had sworn long ago he would never let anyone hold that kind of power over him. And yet, tonight he found himself restless. The gala scheduled to welcome him back to New York had been postponed. The penthouse suite at the Grand Lexington Hotel awaited him. His assistant had already sent up the finest whiskey, the latest financial reports, and the keys to a world that bowed at his feet. But Santiago didn't want any of it. For reasons he couldn't explain, he wanted distraction. Back in Brooklyn, Andrea stumbled into a waiting black car. She was half drunk, her laughter too loud, her courage fueled by bitterness. She didn't notice that Maya's arrangements had gone wrong, that the hotel address she received wasn't for a hired companion, but for the suite of one of the most powerful men in America. The driver opened the door at the Grand Lexington, and Andrea, mistaking opulence for promise, swept through the lobby as if she belonged there. The staff, too intimidated to stop her, let her pass. Her heels clicked against marble floors. Her heart hammered. Somewhere between desperation and recklessness, she told herself this was empowerment. Tonight, she would choose her own story. Tonight, she wouldn't wait for anyone. She pressed the elevator button, swaying slightly. The ride to the top floor seemed endless, and when the doors opened, she walked straight into destiny. The suite was dimly lit, the air rich with the scent of aged whiskey and polished leather. Santiago Lopez, still in his tailored suit, stood by the window, gazing at the skyline that glittered like 1,000 broken promises. Andrea froze. For a moment, her blurred vision betrayed her. She saw only the silhouette of a man, broad-shouldered, commanding, impossibly handsome. This must be him, she thought, the man Maya sent. And Santiago, turning at her unsteady footsteps, narrowed his storm-gray eyes. He expected a board member, a personal assistant, perhaps even an unwanted journalist. Instead, he saw a woman with deep brown skin, glowing beneath the golden light, her curls framing a face too beautiful to ignore her dress clinging to every curve. Her gaze met his, bold in its drunkenness. "You're late," Andrea said, her voice husky, careless. "But you'll do." Santiago's brow arched. "Excuse me." Andrea stepped closer, swaying slightly. "Don't play coy. Maya promised me the best, and I can see she didn't disappoint." For the first time in years, Santiago Lopez laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound that echoed against the walls of his penthouse. And thus, the night began. Stories like Andrea's remind us how easily loneliness can push us into choices that change our lives forever. Sometimes reckless, sometimes foolish, but always unforgettable. If you've ever had a night where one decision rewrote your story, share it in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And if you want to follow Andrea and Santiago's tangled journey, one filled with power, passion, and the kind of love that defies reason, make sure to like this video, follow the channel, and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss their next story. A story that may leave you questioning destiny itself. The city had barely awakened when a pale strand of dawn slipped through the curtains of the Grand Lexington's penthouse suite. Golden light spilled across the room, softening the edges of leather chairs, catching in the crystal glass Santiago had abandoned the night before. The skyline outside still glimmered with the final stubborn stars, but inside, silence pressed heavy as a secret. Andrea stirred. Her lashes fluttered, her head pounding from the wine, her throat dry as though she had swallowed gravel. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. The sheets beneath her smelled of expensive linen and faint cologne, clean, masculine, and unfamiliar. And then her eyes opened fully. The suite, the endless windows, the untouched whiskey decanter glimmered in the light. And him, Santiago Lopez, He stood at the far end of the room, stripped of his jacket, now shirt undone at the collar sleeves rolled. He looked as though he hadn't slept a second. His gray eyes stormy as a sea before a hurricane fixed on her with a mixture of disbelief and something darker. Andrea's breath caught. Reality slammed into her with brutal clarity. This was no hired companion, no casual distraction. The man before her was no one she should have touched, let alone. She sat up quickly, clutching the sheet against her chest. Her cheeks burned hot shame, cutting sharper than any hangover. "Oh my God," she whispered, though the words seemed swallowed by the cavernous silence. Santiago didn't move. He tilted his head, studying her like a puzzle that had no right being in his suite. "You're awake," he said flatly. His voice was smooth, deep, carrying the faintest trace of something foreign, Spanish perhaps. Andrea swallowed hard. I think there's been a mistake." A humorless smile tugged at his lips. "You don't say." She winced, pressing her palm to her temple. Images from the night before bled into her mind, half blurred by wine, the way she had staggered into his suite, mistaking him for the man Maya had promised to send. Her bold words. Her laughter hadn't sounded like her own. His gaze first amused, then sharp, then yielding. And after that, heat lips touch, surrender. Her stomach twisted. Santiago crossed the room, his steps deliberate, controlled. The kind of control that said he was a man used to command, who never let slip even the smallest piece of himself. "Who sent you here?" he asked. Andrea froze. Her mind raced. She couldn't exactly admit she'd mistaken him for an escort. Couldn't confess that loneliness and wine had pushed her into madness. "I got the wrong room," she said lamely. His brows arched, and his eyes glinted like sharp silver for a moment. "The wrong room." "Yes," she insisted, gripping the sheet tighter. I shouldn't be here. Last night was a misunderstanding." Santiago leaned closer, bracing his hand against the wall near her. His presence filled the air, sharp and overwhelming. "A misunderstanding," he repeated slowly, as though testing the weight of her words. "Do misunderstandings usually end with—" His eyes flicked downward briefly, and Andrea's face flushed scarlet. "Such consequences." Her voice trembled. "I was drunk. I didn't know what I was doing." He murmured, his tone caught between disdain and reluctant intrigue. For the first time in years, Santiago Lopez felt the careful order of his life fracture. He had planned everything, the empire he built, the reputation he cultivated, the enemies he kept at bay. His nights were meant to be solitary, predictable, shielded from chaos. Yet here she was, this woman, with midnight dark skin, glowing under the morning light, curls, tangled from sleep eyes, wide with defiance and fear. He should have thrown her out. That would have been easy. He should have dismissed her as a mistake, called security, erased the night with the precision of a man who erased anything threatening his control. But he didn't. Instead, he found himself staring at her, at the line of her jaw, the tremble of her lips, the way she clutched the sheet as if it were armor. Something about her unsettled him. Something about her refused to let him look away. Andrea tried to stand, but her legs wavered. She clutched the nightstand for balance, her heart pounding in her ears. "I need to leave," she whispered, as much to herself as to him. Santiago didn't stop her, not at first. He only watched, his expression unreadable, his jaw tight. But as she moved toward the door, he spoke again. "What's your name?" Andrea froze. Her instinct screamed at her to lie, to give him something false, to vanish and pretend none of this had ever happened. But the weight of his voice, commanding, steady, impossible to ignore, pulled the truth from her lips before she could stop herself. "Andrea," she said softly. The name lingered in the air, foreign and familiar all at once. Santiago repeated it under his breath, testing it like a secret. Andrea. She swallowed. I should go. He didn't block her path, but his eyes followed her every step until the door clicked shut behind her. The elevator ride down felt endless. Andrea's reflection in the mirrored walls looked like a stranger. Wild curls smudged mascara. Lips swollen from a night she could not return. She pressed her hands to her face, willing the tears not to come. How could she have been so reckless, so foolish? The streets of Manhattan hit her like a cold slap. Cars honked. Pedestrians brushed past her. The world moved on as if her life hadn't just split into before and after. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. Santiago remained by the window long after she left, staring at the skyline that no longer felt steady. He told himself it was nothing, a lapse in judgment, a night best forgotten. And yet, the scent of her lingered on his sheets. The echo of her laughter haunted his ears. The Ice King of Wall Street did not entertain distractions. And Andrea Walker, whoever she was, had just become the most dangerous distraction. Hours later, Andrea sat on her couch in Brooklyn, her untouched cake still waiting its candles unlit. She stared at it through swollen eyes. 32 years old, and this was what she had to show for it. Mistakes, regret, and a memory she could never erase. Her phone buzzed. Maya's name flashed across the screen. How was he? Her friend texted, followed by a string of winking emojis. Andrea's hands shook. She deleted the message without replying. But fate, cruel and deliberate, wasn't finished. 2 days later, Andrea walked into the cafe near her apartment, desperate for normalcy. She ordered her usual black coffee, no sugar, and turned to find a quiet seat. And froze. There he was, Santiago Lopez. He was sitting at a corner table reading something on his phone, and his expression was as cold and unreadable as ever. He looked entirely out of place in the little Brooklyn cafe, a man carved of power and money in a room that smelled of burnt espresso and cinnamon rolls. Andrea's heart stopped. For a fleeting second, their eyes met. His lips curved not into a smile, but into something sharper. Recognition. Andrea gripped her cup so hard she feared it might shatter. There was no escape now. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and burnt espresso, a sharp contrast to the cold, controlled world Andrea had stumbled into 2 nights ago. Here, life was simple. The hiss of milk steaming, the chatter of locals, the rattle of spoons in ceramic cups. Yet all of it fell away the instant her gaze locked with his. Santiago Lopez, seated in the corner like he belonged everywhere and nowhere, he was impossibly out of place. The pressed perfection of his tailored suit, cut like a blade against the mismatched chairs and scratched wooden tables. His silver, sleek, and unashamedly expensive wristwatch caught the light as he scrolled on his phone. Andrea froze mid-step, her coffee trembling in her hands. The universe was mocking her. It had to be. Out of all the cafes in Brooklyn, he had chosen hers. She thought of leaving. The door was closed enough, and the bell above it was still within reach. She could vanish before he looked up again, pretend this was a coincidence she had never witnessed. But it was too late. His eyes, those merciless storm-gray eyes, lifted and found her. Recognition flickered. Then something harder, colder settled in his gaze. Andrea's breath hitched. The world around her blurred, the chatter dimming to a low hum. She tightened her grip on her cup, as if it could anchor her. Santiago set his phone aside. He didn't rise, didn't beckon, didn't even smirk. He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, and waited. It was an invitation disguised as a command. Her legs moved before her mind caught up. Each step toward him was heavier than the last, as though the floor conspired to drag her down. She hesitated when she reached his table, clutching her coffee like a shield. "Mr. Lopez," she said, her voice too soft, too brittle. A corner of his mouth twitched, not a smile, but a recognition of her attempt at formality. Andrea. Her name on his tongue was dangerous. Low, deliberate, dragging out syllables as though he savored them. She shifted uncomfortably. "This is unexpected, is it?" His brow arched calm but edged with something she couldn't name. "Brooklyn cafes. Not exactly where I imagined you'd disappear to." Her chest tightened. Disappear. As if she'd been trying to escape him. Which hadn't she? Andrea drew in a breath. "I didn't expect to see you again. That night it was a mistake. I thought we agreed on that." He studied her in silence, his gaze sweeping over her face, lingering on the tension in her jaw, the way she gripped her cup as though it might burn her. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but cutting. "You may call it a mistake, but I disagree." Andrea's pulse jumped. "You don't." What Santiago leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The air between them seemed to contract. "I don't believe in mistakes, only choices." Her lips parted, but no words came. "Tell me," he continued, "was it truly an accident that you walked into my suite? Or was it what you wanted all along?" Her stomach dropped. Heat crawled up her neck. "I didn't. You didn't." His eyes pinned her, demanding the truth she couldn't afford to give. Andrea's throat closed. She wanted to scream at him, to tell him she hadn't known who he was, that she had been reckless, drunk, lonely. But the words caught in her chest. Any explanation would sound like an excuse. So she said nothing. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating. Santiago didn't press. He didn't need to. He had already read the truth in her hesitation. For Santiago, it should have ended here. He should have dismissed her, walked away, and erased her from the pristine order of his world. But Andrea Walker lingered like smoke, refusing to vanish. Something about her unsettled him, the fire in her eyes, even when she trembled. The honesty of her silence. The way her presence pulled at him was fragile and fierce all at once. He tapped the table with one finger. "Sit." Andrea blinked. "Excuse me." "Sit," he repeated. Not a request. A command. Her pride flared. She should refuse. She should turn and walk out, reclaim what little dignity she still had. Yet her body betrayed her. Slowly, cautiously, she lowered herself into the chair opposite him. The cafe around them buzzed with life, oblivious to the silent war between them. Santiago studied her, as though committing her to memory. So he said, finally, "Tell me who you are." Andrea frowned. "I already told you. My name is Andrea." "Your name," he said evenly, "is only the surface. I want to know more." She stiffened. "Why?" His lips curved faintly, not in warmth, but in something sharper. "Because you intrigue me. And I don't allow intrigue to linger unanswered." Her heart thudded painfully. Intrigue. To him, she was not a woman, but a puzzle, something to dissect, to control. Andrea straightened her spine. "There's nothing to know. I live here. I work. I mind my own business. And I don't belong in your world." Santiago tilted his head, his gaze flickering with something unreadable. "Perhaps not. Yet here you are." Her breath hitched. The memory of that night flared vivid and unwanted. She forced her eyes away. "You don't know me, and you don't need to." "On the contrary," he murmured, "I intend to." The words hung between them, charged and dangerous. Andrea's hands tightened around her cup. "Why?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. Santiago's eyes softened, not with kindness, but with calculation. Because you walked into my life uninvited. Because you disrupted everything I had ordered. And because—" He paused, leaning closer. "I don't believe in coincidences." Her chest rose and fell rapidly. His proximity was overwhelming, his scent, a mixture of clean cedar and something darker twining around her like chains. Andrea forced herself to speak. "I can't give you what you're looking for." He studied her, his gaze piercing as though he could see the fractures beneath her words. Then slowly, he leaned back. "We'll see." The rest of the cafe faded into silence for her. The scrape of chairs, the hiss of the espresso machine, the low murmur of conversations, all of it blurred as Santiago's presence consumed the space. Andrea knew she should leave, end it before it began, but her body refused to move. Finally, Santiago reached into his jacket and placed something on the table, a sleek black card embossed with silver letters, Lopez Holdings. Her stomach twisted. "Call me," he said. Andrea shook her head. "I won't." His eyes locked onto hers, steady, unwavering. "Yes, you will." She didn't remember leaving the cafe, only the sharp bite of autumn air when she stumbled outside. Her heart pounded, her palms damp. She had sworn never to see him again. And yet, Santiago Lopez had found her. And worse, he wasn't letting her go. Back inside, Santiago watched her leave through the cafe window, his expression unreadable. He didn't chase her. He didn't need to. Patience was one of his sharpest weapons. Andrea Walker had collided with his world once. He would make sure it wasn't the last time. Brooklyn had always been Andrea's fortress. The cracked sidewalks, the murals splashed across brick walls, the symphony of honking horns and shouted greetings from stoop to stoop. It was chaotic, imperfect, but it was hers. Here, she was not the trembling woman who had stumbled into the orbit of Santiago Lopez. Here she was simply Andrea Walker. Or at least she had been. Because ever since the cafe, she had felt the subtle shifting of her world. It started small, an unfamiliar car, idling too long at the curb as she walked home, a lingering shadow at the corner of her vision. Then came the flowers, which were delivered to the daycare where she worked. Elegant white lilies wrapped in paper that whispered luxury. No card, no name, just silence. Andrea didn't need a signature to know. It was him. The daycare smelled faintly of crayons and baby powder, comfort wrapped in chaos. Children's laughter echoed through the halls, punctuated by the occasional cry, the rustle of tiny feet running across linoleum floors. Andrea loved this world, messy, loud, unpolished. It reminded her of what was real. But that morning, as she bent to tie a shoelace for little Naomi, her boss appeared in the doorway, holding the bouquet. "Delivery for you, Andrea." Andrea froze, the knot slipping between her fingers. Naomi tugged at her sleeve impatiently, but Andrea barely noticed. Her eyes locked on the lilies, their whiteness too stark, too pure, against the grit of her everyday life. She straightened slowly. I didn't order those." Her boss chuckled. "Someone admires you." The other teachers grinned, whispering amongst themselves. Andrea's stomach twisted. She smiled, took the bouquet and set it aside on the counter as though it might bite her. All day her eyes kept straying toward it. All day she felt the invisible thread tightening around her. That evening she left late, the city already dipped in twilight. The lilies were still in her arms because she couldn't bring herself to leave them behind. She hated their message, yet she couldn't throw them away. The streets were quieter than usual. Streetlights flickered to life, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers. And then she saw it. A car parked at the corner, Sleek, black, unmistakably expensive. The kind of car that did not belong on this street. Her steps faltered. The window rolled down. Santiago. He sat behind the wheel, one hand resting casually on the leather, as though he had been waiting for hours and could wait a lifetime more. His gaze found hers, steady, unreadable. Andrea's heart pounded. She wanted to turn around and flee back into the safety of the daycare, but her feet betrayed her, carrying her closer until she stood by the curb. She said, "You shouldn't be here," her voice sharper than she intended. Santiago's lips curved faintly. "And yet I am." Her grip on the lilies tightened. "What do you want?" He tilted his head, studying her, a conversation. Andrea shook her head. "We already had one. Not enough." His voice was quiet, but it carried an edge of finality, as though refusal was a language he didn't recognize. She exhaled shakily. "Mr. Lopez Santiago," he corrected softly. Her chest tightened at its intimacy. "Santiago, you can't just show up like this. This is my life, my world. You don't belong here." His eyes glinted in the dim light. "Perhaps, but I don't believe in boundaries." He opened the passenger door. The quiet click of the lock echoed louder than it should have. "Get in." Andrea's pulse raced. Not to trap you," he said evenly. "To talk. Somewhere. Less exposed." Her mind screamed at her to walk away. Yet curiosity, or maybe some deeper force, rooted her in place. Slowly, reluctantly, she slid into the seat beside him. The interior smelled of leather and something faintly smoky. It was a world apart from her cracked sidewalks and peeling paint. The engine purred to life. They drove silently, the city unfolding around them in flashes of neon and shadow. Andrea stared out the window, her reflection a pale ghost against the glass. Santiago's presence filled the car, heavy and inescapable. Finally, she turned to him. "Why are you doing this?" His eyes remained on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. "Because I can't stop thinking about you." The admission hit her like a blow. She blinked, stunned. "You don't even know me." "On the contrary," he murmured. "I know enough. You carry yourself like the world has taken more than it's given. I know you build walls not to keep people out, but to keep yourself safe. And I know—" He glanced at her, his eyes dark intent. "That the moment you walked into my life, everything shifted." Her throat tightened. She turned away, unwilling to let him see the storm in her eyes. "You're wrong. I'm not who you think I am." "Then show me who you are," he said quietly. They stopped at the waterfront, the East River glinting beneath the night sky. The city rose beyond it, glittering untouchable. Andrea stepped out, the chill biting at her skin. Santiago joined her, his presence too close, too consuming. She hugged the lilies to her chest like armor. "This, whatever this is, it can't happen. You live in a world of power and wealth. I live in reality. They don't mix." Santiago studied her, his expression unreadable. "That may be why I'm drawn to you, because you're real." Her heart skipped. For a moment, the city noise faded, leaving only the sound of the river and the dangerous rhythm of her pulse. Andrea shook her head. "You don't understand. If you stay in my world, you'll destroy it. And if I step into yours—" She trailed off, unable to finish. His gaze softened just slightly. "Then we'll find somewhere in between." She wanted to laugh, to scream, to cry. Instead, she whispered, "It's not that simple." "No," he agreed. "It's not. But nothing worth having ever is." Silence stretched between them, filled with everything unsaid. The lilies trembled in her hands. Finally, Santiago reached out, not to take or demand, but to brush one petal with the tip of his finger. These reminded me of you. Strong, elegant, uncompromising. Andrea's chest ached. She should have pushed his hand away. She should have returned to the car and demanded that he drive her home. But she didn't. Because deep down, she feared he was right. She feared he saw her more clearly than anyone ever had. And that terrified her. That night, when he dropped her off outside her apartment, he didn't press, didn't ask to come in. He only looked at her with those storm-gray eyes and said, "This isn't over." Andrea closed the door behind her and leaned against it, her heart racing. She wanted to believe she could end it. She could cut the thread before it pulled her deeper into his world. But the lilies sat on her kitchen counter, their fragrance filling the air, a reminder of the man who refused to let go. And as she stood in the quiet of her apartment, Andrea realized with a sinking certainty her world was no longer entirely hers. Brooklyn mornings were supposed to be loud, messy, and ordinary vendors shouting over coffee carts, buses groaning against the curb, the rhythm of sneakers pounding against pavement. Andrea had always found comfort in the repetition. Routine was a shield. If her life followed predictable steps, wake, work, return, then there was little space for the chaos of dreams, or worse, for men like Santiago Lopez. But that week, the rhythm faltered. It started on Tuesday, when Andrea noticed a familiar car parked discreetly at the corner outside the daycare. Not the gleaming black sedan from before, but a different one, tinted and understated. The kind of car that wanted to be invisible, but could never truly disappear. By Thursday, she knew the truth. Santiago was watching. Not openly, not with arrogance, but quietly, as though guarding her from a distance. And she hated that she didn't hate it enough. Friday afternoon brought a storm. Dark clouds bruised the horizon, wind whipping the trees until leaves scattered like frantic birds. The children grew restless inside the daycare, their voices rising with the thunder outside. Andrea soothed them, her hands busy with crayons and construction paper, though her thoughts were far away. Then a knock at the door. She opened it and nearly forgot to breathe. Santiago stood there, rain dripping from the shoulders of his tailored coat, stormlight clinging to his frame as though even the weather bent to him. Andrea's heart slammed against her ribs. "You can't be here." He met her gaze evenly unshaken. "I had business nearby. Are you safe?" The word curled around her, warm and infuriating all at once. "This isn't your world," she whispered, glancing behind her at the children. "You can't just appear." He stepped back as if respecting her boundary, yet his eyes remained steady. "Then come outside just for a moment." Andrea hesitated, then slipped out, the rain spitting against her skin. She said sharply, "You need to stop this," hugging herself against the cold. "Whatever game you think you're playing, it isn't a game." His voice was quiet, urgent. "Andrea, do you understand what it's like to walk through a room filled with 1,000 people and feel nothing until one pair of eyes meets yours? And suddenly, everything you thought you knew is wrong." Her breath caught because she did understand. She had felt it too, though she wished she hadn't. But she steeled herself. "You don't know me. You know fragments, shadows, and you think they're enough. They're not." Something flickered across his face, for the first time, frustration, maybe even pain. He nodded once, clipped. "Then I'll learn the rest." Andrea turned away before her resolve shattered. "Don't." But the echo of his words followed her back inside. That night, the storm grew worse. Sheets of rain lashed the city power, flickering in her apartment, until the rooms glowed and darkened in uneasy rhythm. Andrea tried to lose herself in a book, music, or anything that wasn't Santiago, but unease clung to her. Near midnight, a noise cracked through the storm, a shout from the street below. Then the sound of something shattering. Andrea hurried to the window. Three figures lingered near the corner store across her building, restless, volatile young men. One kicked at the shuttered door, laughing harshly. Another swung a bottle, smashing it against the pavement. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't unusual in her neighborhood, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, she was alone. And then, as though conjured by thought, a car pulled to the curb. Sleek, dark, unmistakable. Santiago stepped out. Andrea froze, breath suspended. He moved with calm precision, not reckless bravado, but with a weight that commanded notice. The men stilled their laughter, faltering as his presence filled the street. Words were exchanged low, sharp, inaudible. One of the men tried to sneer, but Santiago's gaze cut through him like glass. And just like that, they scattered into the storm. Andrea pressed a hand against her window pane, the cold biting her palm. She should have been angry at his intrusion, furious at how he inserted himself into her world. But what she felt instead was terrifyingly simple. Relief. The next morning she found him waiting outside her building. Andrea stepped out her umbrella, catching the drizzle, and nearly collided with him. She snapped, "You can't keep doing this," though her voice trembled. Santiago's expression was unreadable. "Would you rather I had stayed away last night? Would you rather those men had hurt you?" Andrea faltered. Her mouth opened, then closed. Because the truth was bitter. No, she wouldn't rather. "I didn't ask for protection," she whispered. His voice softened. "And yet I gave it." The silence between them stretched, filled with rain, and all the words Andrea couldn't bring herself to say. Finally, she stepped past him, forcing her feet forward. But she felt him following like a shadow she could neither escape nor deny. That weekend, she tried to reclaim her normal. The Saturday market bustled with life vendors calling out prices, children darting between stalls, the air thick with the scent of roasted corn and fresh bread. Andrea loved this place. It was grounding, familiar. But as she moved between stalls, she felt him again. Santiago didn't hover. He didn't intrude. He existed at the edge of her vision, his presence steady, silent. Some vendors stared at him, sensing his difference, but he ignored them. Andrea tried to pretend he wasn't there. She haggled over fruit, greeted neighbors, and carried her bags with forced normalcy. Yet every step was colored by the knowledge of him. Finally, she turned, exasperated. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her, his gaze softer than she expected. "Because I can't leave you alone in a world that doesn't deserve you." Her chest ached. "You think you're rescuing me, but you're not. You're suffocating me." Santiago's jaw tightened. He said nothing, but the hurt in his eyes cut deeper than any words. Andrea sat at her kitchen table that night, staring at the lilies still blooming stubbornly in their vase. She had told herself she would throw them away, but she hadn't. Instead, they stood as proof of her failure to sever the tie. Because the truth was undeniable. Santiago Lopez was no longer a fleeting shadow. He was a storm pressing against her walls, relentless and consuming. And worse, some part of her no longer wanted to hold those walls. She closed her eyes, her mind replaying the look in his eyes at the market, the steadiness of his presence in the storm, the way his voice softened when he said her name. Andrea had built fortresses of independence, telling herself she needed no one. But Santiago wasn't asking permission to care. He was doing it. And though she hated him for it, she feared she might hate herself more for needing it. On Sunday evening, the city was calmer. The storm had passed, leaving the streets damp and glistening. Andrea took a walk, hoping the air would clear her thoughts. She didn't expect him to appear. Yet when she reached the small park near her building, he was sitting on a bench, his posture unguarded for once, his gaze lost in the fading sky. For a long moment, she watched him. He looked almost human this way. Not the untouchable billionaire, but a man weighed down by something invisible. Finally, she approached. Do you ever get tired of winning? His head turned, his eyes catching hers. A faint, rueful smile tugged at his lips every day. Andrea's breath caught. She hadn't expected honesty. She hadn't expected vulnerability. She sat beside him, leaving a careful space. Then why keep chasing? His gaze lingered on her. Because some things aren't about winning. Some things are about not losing. The words settled between them, heavy with meaning she didn't want to unpack. She rose before her heart betrayed her. Good night, Santiago. But as she walked away, she realized something terrifying. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted him to stop following. It had been 3 days since Andrea last saw Santiago. 3 days of silence. The shadow behind her steps vanished in 3 days, as if it had never existed. She had thought the absence would bring peace, that his retreat, however temporary, would restore the balance she fought so hard to maintain. But instead, her world felt emptier. The corners are too quiet. The streets are too anonymous. Even her apartment had taken on a coldness she couldn't shake. She tried to focus on work, tried to channel her attention into the children at the daycare, their endless questions and toothy grins. But even as she bent over art projects or tied tiny shoelaces, her thoughts wandered, wondering if he'd come back. I wonder why his leaving hurt more than his presence. That morning she woke with a pressure in her chest, a subtle weight that made breathing a little more challenging. She knew the feeling. The same ache always warned her the past was circling. And she was right. It started with a voicemail from the hospital. Andrea stood in the middle of her modest kitchen, her fingers trembling slightly as she replayed the message for the 3rd time. Ms. Walker, this is Dr. Rice from Brooklyn Memorial. Your mother was brought in last night. Nothing critical at the moment, but we'd advise you to come in. She's been asking for you. Her mother. The name felt like glass in her throat. It had been nearly 5 months since they last spoke, words exchanged in bitterness, walls built by history too jagged to mend. Andrea had walked away that day, promising she wouldn't look back. But here she was, the past knocking not so gently on her present. She changed quickly, her movements automatic. Jeans, hoodie, scarf. She didn't think, didn't plan, just moved. At the hospital, the fluorescent lights cast everything in sterile white. The scent of antiseptic clawed at her senses as she walked the long corridor toward room 412. Every step brought a memory she didn't want. Hospital beds, tubes whispered arguments behind drawn curtains. Her mother had been strong, proud, and often too hard on her. A woman who had built a survival life, sacrificing tenderness for discipline. But she had also been the only family Andrea had ever truly known. And despite everything that meant something, she entered the room quietly. Elaine Walker lay on the bed, her dark skin dull against the white sheets, her hair grayer than Andrea remembered. Her eyes flickered open as Andrea approached, and for a moment neither said a word. Then you came. Andrea nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. They called. Elaine's lips curved into something between a smile and a wince. Didn't think you would. You didn't give me much choice. A pause. Then, still stubborn, her mother murmured. Andrea looked away, still breathing. They spoke little. The words that might have healed had long since withered. But Andrea stayed. She sat beside the bed, listened to the monitor's beep, and watched her mother drift in and out of restless sleep. Hours passed unnoticed. It wasn't until she stepped outside for air that she realized how much she had been holding in. The hospital courtyard was nearly empty. She found a quiet bench beneath a tree just beginning to shed its autumn leaves, and sat there, the weight of memory pressing against her ribs. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Not yet. Is she okay? The voice, low, calm, unmistakable, reached her before the footsteps did. Andrea turned her head slowly. Santiago stood a few feet away, dressed in charcoal gray, his coat catching the breeze. His eyes searched hers, not with expectation, but with something gentler, worry, unspoken understanding. She didn't ask how he knew. She didn't want to know. Andrea looked back toward the tree. She had a seizure. Mild, they said, but she's frailer than I remember. Santiago stepped closer but didn't sit. I'm sorry. Andrea exhaled shakily. We haven't spoken in months. Last time we did, she told me I was selfish. I should have stayed to care for her instead of chasing dreams that wouldn't pay rent. She said that to protect herself, he murmured. Some people choose anger over abandonment, even if it's imagined. Andrea shook her head. It wasn't imagined. I left. I didn't look back. Silence fell between them. Not heavy, but intimate. I didn't think you'd come, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. You didn't call, he replied. But you didn't need to. Andrea turned then, honestly looking at him. There was no mask today, no icy demeanor or guarded calculation. Just Santiago, a man who, for reasons she still didn't understand, had made her pain his concern. I don't want your pity, she said almost defensively. You don't have it, she blinked. Then why are you here? He didn't flinch. Because I've seen people disappear when things get hard. I've been one of them. I won't be that for you. Something cracked inside her, small but deep. Andrea looked away quickly, afraid her eyes would betray her. I didn't grow up soft, she said. I didn't have the luxury of leaning on anyone. You're not leaning, he said quietly. You're standing, even now. And for the first time in days, something inside her steadied. They walked for a while. No destination. Just the rhythm of shoes on pavement, the soft hush of leaves falling. Andrea found herself talking more than she meant to. Her childhood long shifts working 2 jobs, and the dreams she had buried because survival left no room for them. Santiago didn't interrupt. He listened with a patience that unsettled her, his eyes never drifting. And then she asked what she hadn't dared before. What about you? What's your family like? His steps slowed. They're ghosts, he said finally. My father died when I was 20, a heart attack in Madrid. My mother followed 3 years later. Cancer. I was an only child. Or maybe just a lonely one. Andrea softened. That's why you're always in control, because no one else ever held the wheel for you. Santiago gave a quiet, humorless laugh. I thought if I made myself invincible, the loneliness would matter less. She reached for his hand. Not to comfort, to hold. And he let her. That night, Santiago didn't follow her home. He walked her to the hospital entrance, their hands brushing briefly before parting. No promises, no questions. But the silence between them had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. Andrea sat beside her mother again the next morning. Elaine stirred her eyes brighter. You always loved too hard, she murmured, eyes fixed on the ceiling even as a girl. You gave your whole heart and never asked for anything back. Andrea brushed a hand over the blanket. That may be why it hurts so much now. Elaine turned her head slowly. Does he make it hurt less? Andrea hesitated. Sometimes. Other times, he's the reason it hurts more. A small smile ghosted over Elaine's face. Then he's probably worth it. Autumn in Brooklyn had a way of dressing the city in quiet nostalgia. The sidewalks were dappled with amber leaves, the air crisp enough to carry memories in every breath. Andrea stood outside the daycare arms, folded her scarf, tucked up to her chin. The children were inside for afternoon reading hour, and the building was finally silent after the chorus of morning chaos. She should have felt calm, but instead, there was a strange flutter in her chest. because he was coming. For the first time, Santiago would step into her world in daylight, not as a shadow outside her apartment, not as a presence waiting by his car beneath the cloak of dusk. He had asked calmly, clearly, with no expectations, if he could pick her up from work. "I'll wait outside if that makes you more comfortable," he'd said over the phone. "And if I don't come out, then I'll still be there," he'd replied without hesitation. And that's what unsettled her the most. He didn't demand. He didn't chase. He simply stayed. At 300 sharp, she saw the familiar glint of the black Aston Martin curbside. Sleek, silent, a portrait of power even when still. Andrea lingered at the door, watching him through the glass before stepping out. He stood beside the car coat, unbuttoned, his presence somehow out of place and strangely magnetic against the cracked pavement and rusted bike rack. She approached slowly, heart drumming its steady, uncertain rhythm. "Afternoon," he greeted, offering the smallest of smiles. She tilted her head. "You look very Fifth Avenue." He arched an eyebrow. "And you look like a storm I've been waiting to walk through." She blinked, caught off guard by the poetry in his tone. "Is that how you always speak?" she asked. "Only when the silence feels heavier than words." Andrea fought a smile, her guard slipping an inch. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Anywhere you want." That scared her more than any specific plan. They drove without a destination, letting the city guide them. Santiago kept one hand on the wheel, the other occasionally tapping the steering column to the rhythm of Nina Simone, playing low through the speakers. Andrea relaxed slowly, lulled by the voice, the road, and the fact that she didn't have to navigate anything for once. They stopped in Red Hook, where the warehouses met the harbor, and found a small fish shack that Andrea remembered from childhood. It was far from polished paint, peeling from the sign, plastic chairs wobbling on the uneven floor, but it smelled of warm grease and salt air, and it was hers. Santiago didn't flinch. He sat beside her at the cracked table coat folded on his lap, and ordered whatever she did without glancing at the menu. She noticed. "You don't need to pretend to be comfortable," she said. He looked at her, something unreadable in his eyes. "I'm not pretending. I'm just trying to understand." She wanted to scoff. "Understand what?" He gestured around them. "How does this place fit into you?" A woman who carries herself like stone, still smiles when she smells fried shrimp and hears a jukebox from the 90s. Andrea looked down at her hands. "I don't belong in your world, Santiago." He didn't answer right away. "You say that like you think I'm trying to drag you into mine," he finally said. "But maybe I'm the one who wants to leave it behind." She stared at him. "You'd give up skyscrapers for cracked linoleum. I'd trade glass towers for anything that feels honest." Andrea leaned back, skeptical. "And what would your world say about that?" Santiago exhaled. "They'd say I'm distracted, reckless, weak." He turned to her, his voice dropping lower. "But I'd rather be weak and real than powerful and hollow." Something in her cracked. Later they walked along the waterfront. The wind tugged at her curls, and Santiago offered her his scarf. She refused at first, then accepted it in silence. There were children skipping stones, lovers arguing quietly by the benches, and a man playing a trumpet for coins. Nobody dropped. Andrea watched it all, her heart aching with the tenderness she had taught herself to avoid. "You don't talk much about your business," she said suddenly. Santiago looked at her, as if trying to gauge where the question came from. "Most people ask about the money first. I'm not most people." He nodded. "No, you're not." They walked a few more paces before he answered. "I run a venture firm. Investments, startups, disruption, as they like to call it." He paused. "But lately it all feels like noise. Numbers chasing numbers. I built it to escape my past. Now it's become my present. And maybe my prison. Andrea looked up. What were you escaping? His jaw tightened slightly. A family legacy that left no room for softness. My father built empires and broke people to do it. My mother smiled for the cameras and drowned in silence when they left. I didn't want to be like them, so I became worse. She was quiet for a moment. I don't think you're worse, she said. He turned to her eyes dark. Then please tell me what I am. Andrea hesitated, then answered carefully. You're someone who wants to be seen. And maybe for the first time you found someone who doesn't look away. The next morning he surprised her again. She opened her apartment door to find him standing there, not in a suit, not behind a car door, but holding 2 paper cups and a bag of bagels. Peace offering, he said, holding them out. Andrea crossed her arms. What crime are you guilty of? Excessive curiosity, unauthorized caring, loitering near hearts I shouldn't touch. Andrea rolled her eyes, but she was smiling. He didn't come in. They stood in the doorway, eating on the stoop like old friends. He told her about a failed startup he had invested in, a woman trying to create biodegradable phone cases that dissolved in water. Andrea laughed until she choked on her coffee. She told him about one of her daycare kids who had tried to glue googly eyes on a class hamster. By the time the cups were empty, their distance had dissolved. But something else was taking its place. A question, an edge, a fear. Because she could feel herself falling, and she didn't know if there was ground waiting below. That night alone in her apartment, Andrea sat in front of her mirror. She stared at her reflection, at the woman she had become. Independent, sharp, guarded. But her eyes looked softer now. Her lips curved more easily. And in the space behind her heart, a warmth had begun to bloom. She thought about his hands, how they never reached for her, without permission. She thought about his silence, how it never pressed, never demanded. And she thought about his eyes, how they looked at her, like she wasn't just enough, but essential. Still doubt lingered. Could love exist in the space between 2 worlds? Could it survive when one heart was built on caution and the other on control? Andrea didn't have the answers. But for the first time in years, she wanted to find them. The invitation came wrapped in thick cream parchment, sealed with the insignia of the Lopez Foundation, an intricate emblem etched in gold foil, glinting faintly beneath the apartment's warm lamplight. Andrea held it as if it might scald her fingers. She'd found it on her doorstep that morning, nestled in a slim black envelope, Santiago's handwriting inked across the front. Not a text, not a call, a handwritten note. If I stand in my world, I want you beside me. Friday, 7 p.m. I'll wait. It was infuriating how effortlessly he always sounded, both commanding and considerate. Andrea laid the invitation on the table beside her half-drunk coffee, leaned back in her chair, and exhaled slowly. The word gala was printed across the top in elegant serif script. Below it, a list of Manhattan's richest, most revered names, the kind of people who wielded money like a language, who smiled with teeth sharp enough to bleed dignity from the ones who didn't belong. And yet, a part of her small, foolish wild wondered what it would feel like to stand in a room where Santiago belonged. To be beside him, not as a mistake or an accident, but as someone he'd chosen, and someone who kept choosing again for reasons she didn't fully understand. Friday came dressed in a biting chill that made the city's towers gleam colder, sharper. Andrea stood before the full-length mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the deep emerald dress she'd borrowed from her friend Serena, a silk column that clung to her curves and spilled like river water over her skin. Her fingers trembled as she pinned her curls to one side. She hadn't worn makeup in weeks, or bothered to paint her lips since New Year's. Tonight, they burned red. The knock came at exactly 7. When she opened the door, Santiago stood waiting, dressed in a midnight black tuxedo tailored within an inch of his life. But it wasn't the perfection of his look that made her pause. It was the quiet awe in his eyes when he saw her. He didn't speak right away. Then softly, "You'll ruin me." Andrea's throat tightened. "That's not what I want." Too late, he murmured, offering his arm. She hesitated, then took it. The event was held at the Wadsworth Grand Ballroom, nestled atop a historic hotel in Midtown, the kind of place that dripped old money and newer ambition. Chandeliers sparkled like frozen constellations overhead, casting long golden light across marble floors and champagne towers. As they entered, heads turned. Andrea felt it immediately, the eyes. Curious, measuring, glittering behind cocktail glasses and polite smiles. Her skin prickled beneath their gaze, as though she wore defiance like another layer of silk. Santiago didn't notice. Or perhaps he did, and chose not to care. His hand remained steady at her back, guiding her gently through clusters of greetings and flashes of cameras. She heard names she only recognized from headlines. Real estate tycoons, media moguls, a senator's wife. They all smiled the same way. Polished, hollow, calculating. "Darling, we didn't know you were dating," purred a woman in a silver sheath, her diamonds larger than Andrea's wrist, and such a striking companion. "Wherever did you find her?" Santiago's smile never faltered. "She found me." There was a beat of silence too brief to call, awkward, too sharp to ignore. Andrea's chest tightened. They moved on. At the bar, she excused herself to breathe. Santiago remained behind, talking to a man who had introduced himself as Julian Halbrook, a name Andrea vaguely recalled from a scandal involving offshore accounts. She found a corner near the tall windows, sipping water and watching the city lights blink far below. Her reflection stared back in the glass, composed, elegant, unrecognizable. "Quite the picture," said a voice beside her. Andrea turned. A woman in her early 40s, blonde in a pale blue gown, leaned beside her, cradling a glass of rosé. "You're Andrea, aren't you?" the woman asked, tone light, almost amused. Andrea nodded cautiously. "I'm Celeste, Santiago's former fiancée." The world tilted slightly on its axis. Of course he had a fiancée once. Of course she'd be beautiful, composed, a mirror image of this world. Celeste smiled. "He has a type." Andrea stiffened. Celeste continued, eyes drifting toward Santiago. "He always did enjoy projects, especially ones that bite back." Andrea bristled. "I'm not a project." "No," Celeste said smoothly. "You're a statement, and this room eats statements for breakfast." She walked away without another word, leaving Andrea staring at her reflection again. But now, the red lipstick felt loud, the dress too bright, her presence too fragile in the gilded room that felt built to break people like her. When Santiago found her again, her smile had cracks. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, but the lie tasted bitter. "I need air," she said, and walked away before he could follow. Outside, the terrace was nearly empty. Wind whipped across the stone, tugging at her shawl. Below, Manhattan stretched endlessly, glittering, untouchable. Andrea gripped the railing, trying to steady her breath. She had fought too hard, carved too much from stone to be undone by whispers and diamond-studded pity. But she was tired. Tired of being the brave one, the strong one, the outsider asked to justify her presence at every table. She heard the door open behind her. "I should have warned you," Santiago said, voice low. Andrea didn't turn. "About Celeste. About all of it." A beat passed. Then softly, "Why did you bring me here?" He didn't hesitate. "Because this world has had enough of the same faces. I wanted them to see someone who doesn't belong and know that I chose her." Andrea turned, then eyes burning. "You wanted to make a point?" "No." His voice sharpened. "I wanted to make space." They stared at each other, two storms held together by a single tether. Andrea shook her head. "I don't need you to make space for me. I make my own." "I know," he said. "That's what makes you unforgettable." She exhaled, her shoulders trembling. "I don't fit here. Neither do I," he said quietly. "I just stopped pretending I did." They didn't return to the ballroom. Instead, Santiago called for the car, and they drove silently, neither touching nor pulling away. Andrea stepped out when they reached her building, but paused at the door. "You could have told me about her," she said. "I didn't want her name in the same breath as yours." Andrea hesitated, then looked at him. "You wear your world like armor, Santiago. But I've seen the man beneath it, and I'm not sure you're ready for someone who doesn't care about your shine." He stepped forward close, but not touching. "I don't want someone who's impressed. I want someone who sees me and stays." Andrea's breath caught. Then without another word, she stepped inside and closed the door. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she lay in the dark replaying every glance, every comment, every brush of his hand against hers in the crowd. 1,000 unsaid things had been between them, and none felt safe. But beneath the fear, something else stirred. Not love. Not yet. But the ache that comes before it. The ache of beginning to believe. It began on a Monday. The kind of Monday that carried no warning in the wind, just soft winter clouds drifting aimlessly above the skyline, and the smell of roasted coffee rising from street carts on Lexington Avenue. Andrea was halfway through reviewing fabric samples for a Harlem community project she was co-designing when her phone buzzed once, then again, then again. When she reached for it, the screen glowed with a flurry of missed calls and messages. Her fingers paused on one notification that stood out in all caps: Lopez airs new fling or gold digger. She clicked, and the world tilted. In full resolution, there was a photo of her and Santiago standing on the steps of the Wadsworth Ballroom. She laughed at something he whispered, his head slightly bent toward her, her fingers gently resting on his arm. It had been a brief moment, intimate, natural, unscripted. Now it was everywhere. The article beneath was venom, cloaked in velvet. They had called her an ambitious woman from Harlem with no ties to high society. They spoke of her upbringing, college scholarship, and temporary job history as if each were a blemish. There were comparisons. To Celeste, to the daughters of senators, to the heiresses Santiago had once been seen escorting. And then came the innuendos. Insiders say Lopez's sudden attachment to the unknown designer may be short-lived, but potentially catastrophic for his public image. Andrea stared at the screen, as if it might set fire in her palm. Her heart thudded not from the exposure, but from what wasn't there. There was no comment from Santiago, no denial, no defense, just silence. She barely remembered dressing or leaving the building. The air outside bit at her skin, and the city so familiar just days ago suddenly felt like a stranger wearing mirrored sunglasses. Cameras waited outside her apartment. She ducked into a cab, breath, shallow words caught behind clenched teeth. Andrea curled up on the couch at Serena's apartment uptown, with her knees drawn to her chest. The television was off, the lights dim, but the world still found a way in. Serena stood by the window, arms crossed tightly. "This is war." Andrea gave a bitter laugh. "I'm not a soldier. I didn't sign up for this." "You didn't have to," Serena said, voice soft. "You fell for one." That night she didn't sleep, and Santiago didn't call. By Tuesday, it was worse. A talk show segment titled, "Is Santiago Lopez Losing His Edge?" aired, flashing side-by-side images of him with Andrea and him with Celeste. The host called it a downward spiral of public image. Hashtags began trending. Lopez fall. From ballroom to pause. Back streets. Andrea Walker. Exposed. Andrea's social media inbox was flooded with cruel messages, thinly veiled threats, and even unsolicited advice from strangers. Stay in your lane. Know your place. You're embarrassing him. The thing about humiliation is that it doesn't come all at once. It arrives in waves. And when you realize you're drowning, no one's reaching in to pull you out. Wednesday arrived like a knife to the gut. Andrea was scheduled to meet with a potential investor for her community design program. The head of a progressive foundation, Evelyn March, is known for supporting female-led art initiatives in underprivileged neighborhoods. Andrea showed up early notes, prepared sketches, organized her voice rehearsed in the mirror. But Evelyn never came. Instead, an assistant arrived with a polite smile and a paper-thin apology. We're reassessing our media affiliations at this time. Unfortunately, we'll have to postpone indefinitely. Andrea didn't cry. Not there. She left the building and didn't stop walking for 5 blocks. Her heels bit into her skin, but she didn't feel it. Her coat slipped off one shoulder, and she didn't fix it. She kept moving through honking taxis, whispered stares, and silence. When she reached her apartment, the doorman handed her an envelope. No return name, no signature, just her name, written in block letters. Inside was a single card. They will never accept you. Walk away while you still have a name of your own. No threat, just cold truth. That night, Santiago showed up. Unannounced, uninvited, unforgivable. Andrea opened the door to find him standing there, his eyes hollow and shoulders taut beneath his coat. She didn't speak. "I'm sorry," he said. She let the silence hang. "I didn't expect it to blow up like this." "You didn't expect." Her voice was quiet, sharp. "You've lived your entire life under scrutiny, Santiago. You knew what it would look like when I stood beside you." He stepped inside the door, closing behind him. "I thought ignoring it would protect you, that if I didn't fan the flames, they'd die out." Andrea laughed. "They didn't die. They found oxygen in your silence. I didn't want to make it worse. You made it worse by pretending it didn't matter." He looked at her, then raw and unsure. "I didn't know what to say." "You didn't have to say anything," she whispered. "You just had to stand by me." He moved closer, eyes searching hers. "Andrea." But she stepped back. "I believed you," she said, voice trembling. "When you said I wasn't a project, when you told me you wanted someone who saw you, I meant every word." She looked away. "Then why didn't you let them see me too?" The silence returned. Heavy, unbearable. Andrea turned toward the window, arms crossed tightly across her chest. "I have spent my entire life building something from nothing," she whispered. "Every step forward has cost me more than most people can imagine. I was okay being invisible. I learned how to endure that. But I won't be paraded and hidden again when things get hard." Santiago's voice cracked. "I wasn't trying to hide you." "No," she said. "You were trying to protect your image. And I don't fit it." He walked to her slowly, reaching out to touch her hand, but she pulled away. "I love the man I met on the rooftop," she said. "The one who showed me his mother's watch and told me he was scared of forgetting how to feel." Tears threatened her voice. "But I don't know who this man is, the one who lets me be torn apart and doesn't fight back." Santiago swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" She met his gaze. "Let me go." He stood there, still, breathed shallow, heart fractured, then nodded once, and left. Andrea collapsed onto the couch as soon as the door clicked shut. No sobs, just stillness. The kind of stillness that only comes when something has broken so deeply inside you, it doesn't know how to scream. The next day she packed up her things. Serena offered her a room. Andrea turned off her phone, deleted the apps, unplugged from a world that had decided her value based on headlines and hashtags. She started attending the community center every day, earlier than needed. She taught art classes to little girls who didn't know who Santiago Lopez was and didn't care. She lost herself in paint and canvas, finding in color what she couldn't find in people anymore. At night, she sat on Serena's fire escape with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the city that once shimmered like a promise. Now, it just blinked. She missed him. Not the man in the magazines, but the man who once held her wrist like it was sacred. The man who saw her in a crowd smiled like she'd stolen his breath. But missing wasn't enough. Not when it hurt more than it healed. And Santiago, he sat in the corner office of the tallest building on Fifth Avenue, staring at a phone he no longer dared to dial. He read every article. He watched every segment. And he remembered every word she'd said. You wear your world like armor, but I've seen the man beneath it. That man was still here, but the armor had cracked, and this time he wasn't sure if it would ever fit again. Winter in New York had never felt this cold. It wasn't the snow or the wind, but the ache of absence, how a silence between two people could echo louder than sirens on Fifth Avenue. Andrea Walker hadn't seen Santiago in 27 days. 27 days since he stood in her apartment and walked away. And yet, his presence never really left. She saw him in the glint of gold on skyscrapers at sunset, in the way the subway lights flickered, just before fading in every whispered memory that clung to her like perfume. But she didn't reach out. She couldn't. Because some wounds needed air more than they required apologies. Santiago Lopez had built empires out of glass and stone, but now he was sitting in an empty penthouse surrounded by reflections that showed him a man he didn't recognize. He had everything the city's most coveted company, a seat at every elite table, a penthouse view that could silence any storm. But he had no one to call home. He thought of Andrea constantly. She used to tuck her curls behind her ear when she got nervous, and she scrunched her nose at overpriced menus. How she made silence feel like a soft blanket instead of a void. She hadn't just seen him. She had believed in him until he gave her reason not to. And now she was gone. The moment that changed everything happened on a Wednesday afternoon. A junior associate at Lopez Global accidentally forwarded a leaked memo to the press, outlining an unofficial board proposal to distance the Lopez name from controversial personal affiliations. They hadn't said her name, but they didn't need to. Andrea Walker again became a line item on a reputation management spreadsheet. The story exploded. But this time something in Santiago snapped. He stared at the screen at his own board's betrayal, not just of her, but of everything she had brought back into his life. Warmth, truth, love. For too long, he had let others define his world. He had allowed the architecture of his existence to be sculpted by expectation, legacy, and fear. But Andrea had taught him that vulnerability wasn't weakness, but courage in its purest form. And now he would show the world. It started with a single call. To the production director of the Beacon Awards, the most televised philanthropic gala in Manhattan. Lopez Global was the main sponsor. Santiago was slated to present a business innovation grant. He told them he was changing the script. They tried to push back. He didn't let them. Then he called the press. Not for damage control, for an invitation. The night of the gala, New York was wrapped in velvet snow. Carriages lined Central Park. Flashbulbs danced like stars outside the Celeste Grand Hall. Inside, the air shimmered with tension. Everyone who was anyone was there. Senators, CEOs, heiresses, critics, and all of them waited to see how the Lopez scandal would play out. The orchestra quieted. The lights dimmed. Santiago Lopez stepped onto the stage. He looked immaculate in a black tuxedo, but his eyes were clear-focused not on power, but purpose. He stood behind the podium for a beat. Then he looked straight into the camera. To those who came expecting business tonight, he began, voice calm. "I'm afraid I'm going off script." Murmurs rippled across the ballroom. Santiago continued. "Over the past month, my name has been attached to stories, speculations, warnings about how one woman could ruin everything I've built." He paused. "And they're right. She ruined everything. Everything I thought I needed." A hush fell. "She dismantled my comfort, shattered the walls I built to keep people at arm's length. She dared to love me when I didn't know how to love myself, and I let fear silence me." He took a breath, but not tonight. He looked into the camera again, and though the lights were blinding, he saw her face in his mind. "Her name is Andrea Walker. She's the most brilliant designer I've ever met. She turned abandoned brick into hope in Harlem. She sees beauty where others see problems. And she saw something in me I didn't even believe was still there. A beat. I don't want a legacy that fears love. I don't wish for wealth that costs me the truth. I want her." His voice softened. "And I hope she's watching because I'm not hiding anymore." Then he did something that left the room breathless. He stepped from the podium, walked to the edge of the stage, and pulled a small box from his jacket, and opened it. Inside, a simple platinum ring. Elegant, strong, timeless, just like her. "Andrea Walker," he said to the camera's voice breaking. "Come back to me. Marry me. Not because the world expects it, but because we survived it." The screen behind him lit up not with logos or numbers, but with a single image, Andrea laughing at a rooftop, wind in her curls, city lights behind her. The image was raw, candid, and honest. The audience erupted in whispers, applause, even a few gasps. But Santiago didn't care, because in that moment, he had chosen truth over legacy, love over fear. And now the world knew. When Santiago spoke those words, Andrea stood frozen before her television. Serena clutched her arm. "Girl, say something." Andrea didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't cry. She just whispered. He said it. The next morning, Andrea didn't run to him. She walked, with her head high, curls unhidden in a navy coat that matched the midnight sky. She entered the Lopez Tower lobby like it wasn't built to intimidate. And when she reached the top floor, Santiago was already waiting. His eyes met hers, like gravity had finally found its center again. "You said it," she said softly. "I should have said it sooner." She stepped closer. "But you said it when it mattered." He reached for her hand. This time she let him. "Are you ready for the chaos?" she asked. "I'm ready for you." Andrea smiled. "Then let's build something they can't destroy." They married 1 month later, in the heart of Harlem, under the stained glass archway of a community garden that Andrea helped design. There were no tabloids, no guests in couture, just friends, family. Kids from her art program are throwing petals. Santiago wore a charcoal suit. Andrea wore a gown she made herself, simple off-shoulder, woven with tiny threads of silver that caught the sun like stars. When they kissed, it wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, hard-won, and full of promise. Some stories aren't about perfect beginnings, but about choosing each other again and again, despite the noise, despite the doubt, despite the world. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you believe in second chances, we invite you to like this video, comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful love stories like Andrea and Santiago's. Your support helps us share more narratives that reflect not just fantasy, but emotional truth. Let us know. What would you have done in Andrea's place? Do you believe love can survive public scrutiny? We're reading every word. Thank you for being here.